Story number 1. Whispering Frost. I was born in Leningrad, in the winter of 1941. My earliest memory is of cold. It's strange how the body remembers things. Sensations, even when words fail. The bite of frost on my cheeks, the rattle of wind against the walls, the sharp hunger that gnawed at us from within. Those feelings stayed with me long after the siege ended. You might think I was too young to remember the horrors of that winter, but the truth is, some things stay with you forever, and some things never leave. When the Germans encircled our city, we thought we could outlast them. We had our pride, our courage, and our resilience, but we didn't count on the winter. The temperature plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the snow came, thick and relentless, burying everything under its weight. We were trapped, 2 million of us, locked in an icy tomb. And the hunger, oh, the hunger. I was just a boy, 6 years old, when the whispers began. First, it was faint, like the wind through the cracks in our apartment. We lived on the top floor of a crumbling building near the Neva River. My mother, my sister Anya, and my father had gone to fight months before, and we hadn't heard from him since. The whispers came at night, soft and indistinct, barely more than a murmur. I thought they were my imagination, a trick of the wind. But then, one night, I heard them say my name. Alexei. The voice was cold and thin, like ice shattering in the dark. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and looked toward the window. Frost had crept over the glass, tracing delicate, skeletal patterns that glittered in the pale moonlight. Beyond it, the city was dark and silent, a wasteland of snow and ice. Alexei, the voice came again, a ghostly echo. I pulled the blanket over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to believe it was just the wind. The next morning, I told my mother what I'd heard. She dismissed it, her voice weary. "It's nothing, Alexei, just the storm. Now, help your sister with the stove." But Anya believed me. She was only a year older than me, but she had a way of looking at the world that made her seem older, wiser. That day, as we huddled around the faint warmth of the stove, she whispered to me, "I hear them too." The whispers grew louder as the days passed. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were calling Anya's too, and then my mother's. Sometimes they sounded like my father's voice. Other times, like people I'd never heard before. They spoke in tones that were both urgent and accusing, their words half lost in the howling wind. Anya was the first to see them. We were lying in bed one night, the cold so bitter it felt like the walls were closing in on us. She shook me awake, her eyes wide and terrified. "They're outside," she whispered. I followed her gaze to the window. First, I saw nothing but the frost and snow, but then I noticed movement. Shadowy figures gliding through the storm. They were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow pits that glowed faintly in the darkness. They didn't walk, they floated, their feet barely brushing the ground. And they were watching us. "Don't look at them," Anya whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't like it when you look." I pulled the blanket over my head, but I could still feel their presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the thin walls of our apartment. The hunger grew worse. We ate anything we could find, potato peels, glue scraped from the back of wallpaper, even the soles of our shoes. But it wasn't enough. People started disappearing. Sometimes we'd hear the sounds of struggle in the night, a door creaking open, a scream quickly silenced, and then they were gone. One morning, we woke to find our neighbor, Mrs. Karpova, lying in the snow outside. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky, and her lips were blue. The whispers were louder that day, almost jubilant, like they were laughing. My mother grew weaker with each passing day. She stopped speaking, her eyes glassy and distant, as if she were already halfway to the other side. One night, as Anya and I sat by the stove, she stood suddenly and walked to the window. "They're here," she whispered. "They've come for me." We tried to stop her, but she pushed us away with surprising strength. She opened the door and stepped out into the snow. The whispers swelled, filling the air with their icy song. And then she was gone. We never saw her again. After that, it was just Anya and me. The whispers didn't leave us alone. They followed us everywhere, growing louder, more insistent. "Come to us," they said. "It's warm here." Anya began to change. She grew quieter, her eyes darker, her movements slower. One night, I woke to find her standing by the window, staring out at the storm. "They're beautiful," she said, her voice distant. "They're not monsters, Alexei. They just want to help. They killed Mama," I hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. She didn't argue, but the look in her eyes scared me more than anything. It was as if part of her had already left. The night Anya disappeared was the coldest of the winter. The stove had gone out, and the apartment was like a tomb. I woke to the sound of the door creaking open and saw her slipping into the snow. I screamed her name and ran after her, but the storm swallowed her whole. I collapsed in the snow, sobbing, the whispers swirling around me. "Alexei," they called. "You're alone now. Come to us." I don't know how I made it back to the apartment. When the rescue teams finally broke through the siege weeks later, they found me half frozen, clutching a scrap of Anya's scarf. Now, decades later, I still hear the whispers. Every winter, when the snow begins to fall and the frost creeps over my windows, they return. They call my name, just as they did all those years ago. And sometimes, in the shadows of the storm, I see them, pale and gaunt, their hollow eyes glowing in the dark, watching, waiting. I know they're not done with me. Not yet. Story number 2. Whisper of the Andes. It's been 50 years since the crash, but I can still feel the cold. Not the kind of cold you escape by pulling a blanket tighter or stepping closer to a fire. No, this cold is alive. It burrows into your skin, your bones, your soul, and it stays there. You don't forget it. Not ever. I was only 19 when we boarded that plane. A wide-eyed kid who thought the world was nothing but fields to run through and mountains to climb. We were headed to Chile for a rugby match. My teammates and I were loud, laughing, full of life. We were invincible, or so we thought. The first sign that something was wrong came as we flew over the Andes. The turbulence shook the plane like a rag doll, and the laughter turned to nervous murmurs. Then came the sound, a metallic screech, like the plane itself was crying out. I remember clutching the armrest as we plummeted. The screams around me were deafening, but the moment of impact was silent, utterly silent, until the screaming began again. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the snow. The plane was in pieces, scattered like a child's forgotten toy. Bodies were everywhere, some moving, most not. Blood stained the pristine white landscape, a vivid, violent red. My leg was broken, twisted at an angle that made me nauseous just to look at. But I was alive. That was all that mattered. First, survival was all we could think about. We built makeshift shelters from the wreckage and huddled together for warmth. The nights were the worst. The cold didn't just bite, it devoured. Each breath felt like shards of glass slicing through my lungs. We rationed the little food we had, but it didn't last long. Hunger gnawed at us, relentless, a beast that grew louder with each passing day. And then the whispers began. It started on the third night. I thought it was the wind at first, howling through the mountains, but then I realized it was more than that. Words, faint, indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Diego, one of my teammates, asked if anyone else noticed the voices. Most of us laughed it off. Stress, hunger, exhaustion, we blamed it on anything but what it really was. But the whispers grew louder. They started calling our names. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of my mother's voice. She was calling to me, her tone soft and soothing, like when I was a child. But my mother wasn't there. She was thousands of miles away, safe and warm. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the freezing air. By the second week, the line between waking and dreaming blurred. I started seeing things, figures moving in the distance, just beyond the wreckage. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements too smooth, like they were gliding over the snow. One night, I saw one standing at the edge of the camp, watching us. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. We tried to ignore it, to focus on surviving, but the hunger was unbearable. You can't imagine what it's like unless you've been there. The way it consumes every thought, every feeling. You stop being human. You become an animal, desperate. When the food was gone, we turned to the only thing left, the bodies of the dead. The first time was the hardest. We sat in a circle, staring at the frozen corpse of Roberto, a boy who had been full of life just days before. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew what had to happen. It was Nando who finally did it, slicing into the flesh with trembling hands. The sound of the knife cutting through the frozen skin is something I'll never forget. It echoed in the silence, loud and sharp. We told ourselves it was survival, that we had no choice. But the whispers didn't let us forget. They grew louder, angrier. They mocked us, called us monsters, and maybe we were. The figures came closer after that. First, they stayed at the edges of the camp, but soon they were among us. They didn't walk, they floated, their feet never touching the ground. Their eyes burned like coals, and their mouths hung open, whispering words we couldn't understand. They pointed at us with long, skeletal fingers, accusing, condemning. One by one, they took us. It always happened at night. We would wake to find someone missing, their sleeping bag empty, the snow around it undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just gone. But we would hear their screams, faint, distant, carried on the wind. We tried to stay awake, to keep watch, but the cold and exhaustion were too much. The figures were patient. They waited until we were weak, until we couldn't fight anymore. By the time Nando and Roberto set out to find help, there were only a handful of us left. The rest had either died or disappeared into the night. I wanted to go with them, but my leg made it impossible. I stayed behind with 3 others, huddled together in the wreckage, waiting. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were inside my head. I started seeing things, my mother, my father, my little sister, all standing in the snow, their arms outstretched, their faces twisted in sorrow. "Come to us," they said. "It's warm here." I almost believed them. When the rescuers finally came, I was the only one left. They found me sitting in the snow, surrounded by the bodies of my friends. I told them about the whispers, the figures, but they didn't believe me. They said it was the cold, the hunger, the trauma. But I know the truth. I still hear the whispers. Late at night, when the world is quiet, they come back, calling my name. Sometimes, I see the figures at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. The Andes doesn't let you go. Not really. Keeps a part of you, and it follows you, no matter how far you run. And one day, it will call me back. Story number 3. The Hunger of Sierra Nevada. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I've always been drawn to the dark corners of history, the places and stories where humanity loses its civilized sheen and something primal takes over. The Donner Party was one of those stories. I thought I knew it all. The desperate settlers, the snowbound mountain pass, the whispered horrors of cannibalism. But stories, no matter how often they're told, can't capture the weight of a place. That's why I found myself in the Sierra Nevada in late October, armed with a notebook, a recorder, and a determination to uncover something new. The cold was the first thing I noticed. Even before we reached the site, the air had a bite that seemed sharper than it should have been for the season. My guide, Tom, a seasoned outdoorsman with the look of someone who had spent more years in the wilderness than in civilization. Didn't seem bothered. He spoke sparingly, answering my questions with grunts or short, clipped sentences, but I could tell he didn't like the job. I should have listened to the unease in his voice when he finally said, "Places like this, they don't forget." We reached the clearing just before dusk. The remnants of the Donner Party's makeshift camp were long gone, reclaimed by the forest. All that remained were faint depressions in the earth, where structures had once stood, and the eerie silence that seemed to hang over the place like a shroud. I set up my tent while Tom built a fire, the crackling of wood the only sound in the oppressive quiet. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the temperature plummeted, and the shadows grew long and jagged, like claws raking across the snow-dusted ground. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it strange undertones, almost like voices, faint and just out of reach. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind spurred on by the isolation and the stories I'd spent weeks immersing myself in. But then, just past midnight, I heard it, a low, mournful moan, not human but filled with something raw and desperate. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the biting cold. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that flickered and danced around the clearing. I scanned the trees with the beam of light, my breath fogging in the icy air. Something moved just at the edge of the clearing, a shadow too large to be an animal but too indistinct to be human. I called out, my voice shaky, "Who's there?" No response, just the wind and the faint rustling of branches. The shadow was gone, leaving behind an uneasy stillness that settled deep into my bones. I retreated to my tent, pulling the zipper tight and gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. Sleep was a long time coming. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease as Tom and I hiked further up the mountain to an old cabin site that had once been part of the Donner Party's encampment. The cabin was little more than a few rotted beams and a collapsed roof, but the air around it felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite define. While Tom explored the perimeter, I crouched near the crumbling hearth, running my fingers over the frost-covered stones. As I sat there, a strange compulsion overtook me. I pulled out my notebook and began to write, the words flowing onto the page without conscious thought. We are the hunger. We are the cold. We are always watching. The moment I realized what I'd written, my heart skipped a beat. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of putting those words down. My hands trembled as I tore the page out, crumpled it, and shoved it into my pocket. When Tom returned, I forced a smile and pretended nothing was wrong. That night, the dreams began. I was back in the cabin, but it was whole, the walls intact and the fire roaring in the hearth. Around me were people, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes reflecting the flames. They sat around a crude wooden table, tearing into a meal with ravenous intensity. The smell of decay hung thick in the air. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. One of them looked up, its mouth smeared with blood and its eyes burning like embers. It reached out a skeletal hand and whispered, "Join us." I woke with a start, my body drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. The whispers I'd heard in my dream hadn't faded. They lingered, faint but insistent, just outside the edges of my hearing. I stepped out of the tent, hoping the cold air would clear my head. But the clearing was different now. The shadows were deeper, darker, and the trees seemed to close in around us. I felt watched, not just by one presence but by many. Tom emerged from his tent, his face pale and drawn. "We need to leave," he said, "first thing in the morning." I wanted to agree, but something held me back. The whispers were calling me now, my name woven into their haunting melody. That night, I didn't sleep. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers but screams. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled into the woods. Drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The forest was alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees, too fast to be seen clearly. I followed the sound of the voices, my feet crunching through the snow, until I reached a clearing I didn't recognize. At the center was a figure, its body emaciated and its skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness as it turned to face me. "We're hungry," it rasped, its voice a guttural echo that seemed to come from all around. Behind it, more figures emerged, their bodies twisted and broken, their mouths filled with jagged teeth. They moved closer, their whispers blending into a deafening roar. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I stumbled through the forest. The figures always just behind me, their footsteps crunching in unison with mine. When I finally burst back into our campsite, Tom was waiting, his rifle raised. He fired into the darkness, and the figures retreated, their shapes dissolving into the shadows like smoke. We packed up and left at first light, neither of us speaking a word until we were safely back in civilization. But the whispers haven't stopped. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear them, faint but persistent, calling me back to the mountains. I see their faces in my dreams, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see a reflection that isn't mine. The hunger is inside me now, and I don't think it will ever let me go.